Thank you for the invitation to take part in this webinar, and thank you for the transition, this ordinary dimensional, productive landscape dimension. So I can now move on from the Danube and the Rhone and talk to you about smaller waterways, even if I will be talking about a project that is important. I'm going to give you the geographer's point of view, the social geographer's point of view when it comes to environmental restoration. Now, the assertion of ecological principles means a change, a shift in paradigm when it comes to waterways. So there will be new questions that come up, because restoration, environmental restoration, means questions about references, types of nature that we desire. So there's a certain amount of resistance. There are blockages at national level, and I will talk about that in this presentation. But for colleagues from other countries, that can be interesting as well, because restoration, especially ecological continuity that I'm going to be focusing on today, is important. I'll be talking about local blockages, local obstacles. And I'm sorry, I apologize. Right now, I won't have time to go into detail, so I'll try and give you a kind of some broad ideas about work being carried out as part of a number of programs. So here is a map. Let me just get my pointer working. So there's a map here. So I'm talking about the Cellune program, and there's another map here. It's a waterway that goes into the Bay of Mont-Saint-Michel. There are two big hydropower plants. So one of them was demolished a few months ago. The second will be following, and they're quite high. And then we have other programs. It's effluents and urban streams. I'll be talking to you about a specific type of restoration, which is restoration of a longitudinal continuity, because this is the most emblematic kind of operation, but it's also the most conflictual operation. So what I'm interested in here is to find out how these operations sometimes involve constraints, but are often drivers for the construction of new local projects. I'm going to place my presentation. I'm going to base it on the fact that restoration happens in hydrosocial areas. In other words, rivers cannot be considered only as naturalistic objects. Restoration cannot just be considered as an action that is technical, ecological, or based on fish. It has to be considered in relation to the other effects and consequences, especially when it comes to transformation and the creation of places. So we need to therefore take more into account the territorial plurality, different perspectives, different points of view when it comes to rivers and nature. So this is encouraging. It encourages us to look at all of the components and their interactions. So what I'm going to say is based on two questions. How can we better link ecological projects with local projects? And an underlying question, the role of inhabitants and users in the construction and development of these projects. So I'm going to organize my presentation in 3 steps. I'm going to focus on the sensitive dimension of environmental restoration, and then I'll go into the question of accompaniment, for such public action in France. And then thirdly, I'll talk about political component, the political component. So the sensitive dimension first. This is based on an observation that may appear to be obvious, but it's something that has been neglected. Environmental restoration reconfigures river landscapes, whether we're talking about the line, whether we're talking about getting rid of dams, whether we're talking about bringing out things that were buried, or other actions on the alluvial plain that can be diverse. So given this observation, the transformation will be represented differently according to people. Let's take the example of the Sélune. So here you have a map with the two lakes, the two artificial dams, which are artifacts that have been appropriated by the inhabitants and users. So there are places where people go, there are huts, there are fishing spots. So these places reflect the interest that these populations have in this area. So these people come from small villages in the northwest of France. They come and they find refuge along the river. So, you know, the way people see these objects are it can be very different depending on who the people are, but there is appropriation. So this is the lake that disappeared in 2018 and 2019. If I continue with the example of the Sélune, and you can see that the question of representation is the right question to ask. When the state asks a local authority to think about restoration actions, you can see that there is always fear. Well, there's a very strong question about vegetation, about the plants. So in the place of the lake today, for the moment, there's nothing. There's vegetation that is beginning to grow, but this raises fears among a part of the local population. They see the wasteland as a real problem. And this even triggers, you know, cleaning operations. They want to clean up this nature that they want to control. They want to do some maintenance work, but at the same time, the promoters of those who want to get rid of dams, given the absence of any local projects, begin to think about a strategy to rewild the area, to make different forms of nature emerge. So beyond that, if we carry on, behind these landscapes, there's a very strong attachment to the place that we can see. Here we have some illustrations of Sélune. You could, Sélune, sorry, we've got a lake that is very important for a certain number of social actions. The population is very much attached to this lake, but we can see the same thing for other waterways that are even smaller. We've talked about the Danube and the Rhone, but you can have the same thing at other proportions on smaller waterways, for the River, for example, which is smaller. So there's this notion of social connectivity that emerges. So we're invited to think about hydrosystem, longitudinal connectivity, vertical connectivity, and the relationship that exists or that can exist between the populations and the river via a whole range of different uses. So there's a feeling of attachment that really comes to the fore with respect to the river. So once we've said this, then we have to reconsider these stakeholders, you know. When we talk about small waterways, and this is the subject of my study, we need to consider these stakeholders, these actors. who are going to come around the table. They feel that they are owners of the banks and part of the bed of the river, so you can't do any projects without them. But in reality, there are also other actors, users, but beyond that, you can also think that it might be a good idea to widen this circle of stakeholders and integrate not just the actors concerned, but also those who may be interested, in other words, associations or inhabitants who don't have any direct impact on the operation, but who might find it interesting and may act as a relay when it comes to developing the project. This is what I've tried to represent here. So this is some work, some comparison work. We compared two dismantling processes, the first on the lawn and the second on the Mesconenton in New Jersey in the United States. So gradually, as the projects emerged, but over the course of public meetings, a certain number of new actors appeared, and these actors were integrated. And this made it possible to enrich the project. And to begin with, you know, these projects were quite modest, but they could have remained just technical projects or ecological projects or fish-related projects because there are fish challenges. But in fact, they became projects that really reflect the challenges of the local areas because of the stakeholders involved. So here, there was a structure that was dismantled on a small river called the Beuvron, and the elected officials were involved in this project. And this meant that it was possible to improve the local context. There were some factories, so the industrial wasteland was improved. And in this case, when you've got a meeting between the ecological sphere and the territorial sphere or the political sphere, what happens then? People become concerned and involved. And so the project grows. So this is the second point that I would like to go through. That is the way these projects are accompanied. So we can go back to the example of the cellule, because it speaks for itself. One might expect that this public action, especially when it has to be, when it wants to be exemplary, we might expect that it's accompanied by a certain effort to inform people. But for the cellule, there wasn't enough information. There were some bulletins placed in letterboxes. There were some signs, some posters put up, but quite late in the day. And the information was very much focused on the technical aspects, as you can see from the pictures. Now, what happens when this is the case? Well, when you question the local population, this is what was done through a thesis, not only are they dissatisfied in terms of the way they were informed, but they have no real detailed knowledge, and that's a euphemism, of the real objectives of the operation. And that's a first obstacle to appropriation. Appropriation for this kind of project, because they didn't receive enough information. And then also from a dynamic point of view, the fact that there was no information meant that there was a free field to any opponents to the project. So they occupied the local stage. So now let's move from the cellule to more ordinary waterways or more ordinary operations. And here I'm focusing on work that we carried out where we looked at the Seine and affluents of the downstream river, like the Eure. We looked at how the project owners informed the local populations during a restoration program that focused on ecological continuity. The first observation was that in most cases, in a high number of cases, there was no real mediation effort made. There were 135 documents that were found. And when you look at these documents, the documents that exist, and this is what we did when we did our characterization work, you realize that they're very much focused on the technical aspects, the work itself. And we also looked at how these documents kind of fitted in the space. So here the idea was to say, okay, ecological continuity is something that's not easy to understand for everybody. You know, maybe something needs to be explained. In 54% of the documents, in fact, no hydrological connection is referred to. What do I mean by that? Well, by opposition, if you look at this side, in 30% of cases, the destruction of structures allows us to join an affluent or the coastline, but in most cases, we don't use these references to explain that the dismantling of structure will create a line which is good for sediment transport or fish movements. And also, when you look at the scales that need to be mobilized in order to allow longitudinal restoration, you can see that in most cases we're talking about very small scales. Either it's the dam or the threshold, sorry, the weir that has to be dismantled, or it might be some kind of mill on the hydropower site. So it's maybe a complex of different structures, but you can see that the scale is fairly small. And there isn't much perspective shed on a bigger line in terms of the catchment area. And there is the fragmentation of different unions as well. And this reveals that there is too much focus on technical aspects. So here you've got a picture on the right-hand side. This is based on a colossal amount of work listing obstacles across France. So this is in fact a tool today that's not, if it's not used properly, it's going to make it very difficult to reroute these structures in their context and in their historic line. So there's so the values associated with the work are not the right values. So it's, if you take the notion of body of water, this replaces river in official documents like the Water Framework Directive. So we need to think more about how these ecological restoration projects are developed. If they have too much of an expert ring to them, then there's a risk of building places that are based on science alone and that neglect the quality of the relationship that people have with these spaces and environments. Now, let me go to my third point. Marianne, you've got 2 minutes. Okay, yes, I'll try and hurry up. So the third point concerns the political aspect. How do you prioritize the challenges? Because things are increasingly complex. Here we can see this with the Sélune River. There are other challenges, flooding, pollution, etc. So that's why it's important that science plays a role because of the complexity. Science has to play a role of emancipation. So salmon as well is an emblematic species, charismatic. A charismatic species. It's good to focus on the salmon species, but unlike a certain number of operations that can be cited in North America, where there's a real relationship to salmon, not just with Amerindians, but this link doesn't work in the same way. So it's a species that's being highlighted to the detriment of other ordinary species. Let me just finish now. Well, let me just show you this graph. The idea behind this graph is to show the challenge. One of the big challenges is to repoliticize environmental restoration. And it has to be properly articulated with local projects. It has to be better integrated. And to conclude, what we can say is that these environmental restoration projects, raise a number of questions. Our relationship with all things ordinary, but also our ability to go beyond the separation between nature and culture. It's about replacing restoration projects inside political projects. It's also about improving environmental education. It's all about accompanying people, providing them with the right kind of information, making sure that the technicians and scientists also help with facilitation and mediation. Sorry, perhaps it was rather fast what perhaps I went rather quickly through that, but thank you very much.